I had a viewer coaching request in my Discord server, and which you are all welcome to do as well. But today the question, it's a big wall of text, but I wanna. This is the wall of text has a lot of different pieces of problems that we can solve independently, and I think it's complex enough of a problem to kind of try and solve piece by piece. So the goal of this video is to talk about the first piece, and in order to do that I need to give you the big picture. So this person is having trouble basically with hypersensitivity to the possibility of criticism and rejection. And this manifests in work and personal life. So in work, they are 2 years out of college, and the managers you have, like when you're working, I'm assuming it's a software engineering kind of a gig, and you have one-on-ones with your managers, right? And these people are fine, and they're basically your manager trying to have a civil one-on-one with you, but my client, my virtual Discord client, feels themselves getting very defensive, like the chest and throat like tightening, and brow furrowing, and the cheeks like reddening. Even if the work they talk about isn't necessarily lacking, only because it just feels like to them it's not good enough. And so whenever you go to these meetings, it's just so hard to feel at ease because there's this constant threat of feeling like, oh my god, am I gonna be attacked or not? And personal life wise, they've been kind of socially isolated on and off since middle school, but they don't really try and actively keep maintaining close friends because they don't like reaching out if they're struggling, because it seems like a sign of like weak character or whatever, something along those lines, right? Okay, and each of these can be addressed in a separate video, but the one I want to talk about today is this. This mentality is something that my father and grandfather would agree with. And basically, the mentality in reference is like this competitive mindset that when I am being criticized, you can criticize me for my fashion, you can criticize me for my appetite, you can criticize me for my, like what I eat. But when it comes to performance, when it comes to your, ability to be a, functioning society member, your ability to have kind of like this social stature, when that's at risk, this is a big problem, and we need to compete, and I need to be at the top. And so this is kind of like what I really want to talk about today in this video, because this person has mentioned to me that they are Asian American, and now Asian fathers and grandfathers. I don't think I never really specifically talked about this, so I want to dedicate this video to talking about that. If we are in our 20s and 30s right now, right? That means our parents are most likely from the post-World War II generation, or near the end of the World War II generation, which means our grandparents are probably undergoing the after effect of World War II. And they know what it's like to be in the depth of war, and they know what it's like to have ravaged land. And so, speaking in terms of like, Asian countries, basically no country was really safe, right? From the effects of World War II. Japan is largely known as the oppressor, but it had like a nuclear strike twice. And the economic effects of basically losing a war, it's fairly big to pay, right? Korean War, North South, like the UN and the entire Soviet army and the North Korean and the Chinese army basically decimated the whole land. China, rape of Nanking, and a bunch of other things happening along, the Russian and the Japanese conflict and things like that. Philippines, needless to say, it's like Japan, America, all that pizzazz. Vietnam War, need I say more? Thailand, kind of okay, but Thailand also has their own share of like regional conflicts with the neighboring islands, right? Indonesia, Malaysia. Indonesia is under the influence of Netherlands, and Malaysia again like strife with Singapore, and then like the after effect of World War II, just like everywhere, right? So whether it be the French, whether it be American, whether it be Japanese, whether it be the Dutch, be colonialism, World War II, imperialism, the effects were just kind of crazy. And now, those are all individual contributors that have a rippling effect to our lives today. Because in war, we have to understand, in war, your sense of safety is almost always in jeopardy. Because you don't know what's gonna happen. Who knows? The front line may move like this way, and unexpectedly there might be an air raid. These are all things that actually happened not that long ago, right? So, when everybody is at peace, we get to enjoy the peace, and we get to think about material possessions. We get to assume that peace will continue. But in the midst of war, we have practically no choice but to be in fight or flight all the time. Which means our tendencies of self-preservation, right, is going to be almost always in hyper mode. So when we are at peace and we know that there's a meal tomorrow and the day after, we're able to reserve the food. But when you don't know when you're gonna be eating the next time, then it's natural for you to want to amass as much food as possible right now. And when you're full, the thought of giving it to others, of course it's possible, right? But it's just, as a whole in society, it's so difficult for you to share because you want to preserve yourself for tomorrow. So, the specific element of needing to compete with others for resource in not a calm way, but in a frenzied state of mind, is something that comes from Asian grandparents. So this is when, again, the difference between our grandparents' generation and our parents' generation is that in our grandparents' generation, it is so hard to not be frenzied. It is so hard to not be consumed by this constant threat of death, this constant threat of genocide. And now, war ends, and everything is rebuilding, right? So, although times are really hard, the opportunity to rebuild everything is kind of a race. It becomes a form of a race. Because now, before it was all about survival, but now there's peace. And when there is peace, now we get to calm ourselves down, and we have an opportunity to rebuild our society, re-establish all the infrastructure and things like that. Unfortunately, had we been rebuilding ourselves using the traditional regenerative kind of methodologies that we always used to rely on as kind of animals, right? Relying on tribe, relying on neighbors, relying on a sense of community, doing the work ourselves, and then sharing the, like, not in kind of a, again, this is, everything I say isn't really about ideology, so not going so far as to have like a social system, like a socialism, to like, make sure that everything is, spread like, fairly as possible, and then, assumption of power. I'm not talking about like Marxism or anything like that, but I'm saying all other animals, like wolves and, feral dogs and elephants, after they go through kind of a tough period of no food, and then they are able to, maybe there was like a forest fire and so on, these animals are able to rebuild their systems in a collective way as like a pack, right? And there may be some inner, strife, but the animals, they don't really care about like, hoarding the most resources, and they don't really have this idea of relative worth and net worth and things like that. So it is possible for us to rebuild ourselves that way, so that we can kind of be a self-sufficient neighborhood, self-sufficient society, self-sufficient, country, county, and things like that. But who's the most powerful after the war? It's the victors. And so it's very likely that the way of the victors will be installed upon the losers, right? And the Cold War is all about ideology, right? And so what unfortunately gets added to the mix of the post-frenzy of the World War II is capitalism and relative worth. Basically, you are able to capitalize on some things. If you can get the timing right, and if you can get the demands right, you can be rich. And that door and that opportunity is open to anyone. That's the free market philosophy, right? So now, when people get a taste of this, right, people enter that race. Now the difference is willingly. Because once you go through war, once you go through this horrible time, it's traumatizing, right? And so because you define the past as a wound, something that you never want to experience again, something that you want to do is anything that will remove you far away from repeating the potential of the past. And so in our parents' generation, they willingly put the hat of competitiveness for the sake of being ahead, for the sake of not being the victims that we were in the past, that our grandparents were. And that's what makes our parents so resourceful. That's what makes our parents able to grind on their own. Nobody wants them to grind. They want to grind. Because why? At that point in time, it is the way of life where there's a drastic difference between having that kind of life versus not having that kind of a life. If there wasn't a war, right? If there was no idea that there's this horrible experience that we just went through, kind of staying in the neutral ground is okay, because we associate neutralness as like, neither being that good, neither being that bad, right? But the thing is, our idea of neutral has just been ravaged down to the ground because of the war. So now, it's either you stay here and rot, or you make it out. And one possibility is making it out so that you're so successful. And the other possibility is just making it out so that you reach a baseline that's different from the war-ravaged fields. And that's the reality that our parents went through in their generation. And now, we come to our generation, right? Our generation has nothing to do with this, almost, because we have experienced peace mostly for a very long time, right? And so the idea that, we have to fight for survival, the idea that we have to, always be thinking about escaping and sheltering, that doesn't really live in our minds, right? But it's important that some places in the world are actually going through this today, and that's why it's so important for me to talk about and advocate for world peace in videos like this too. Because the trauma of war, unless everybody is actively engaged in their minds and is able to contain their suffering, it will cascade on like this. So the conditions are different now. There is no more war that you may be actively experiencing in your life, or your parents for that matter, or your grandparents for that matter. But the habits of how they have lived carry down generation and generation through something called karma. So, after the war, when your grandparents were raising your parents, it will be very difficult for them to raise their children, raise your parents in a peaceful manner. Because they were at the time when babies cried, that noise may alert the enemies. So babies crying was a matter of survival for your grandparents, right? And that kind of mentality that life can always be threatened. And there are always enemies within us, especially through McCarthyism and such. That overall unease, that overall a fight or flight response, your parents directly learned by experiencing that from their parents. And think of all the, especially if you're from an Asian culture, think of all the, generational kind of filial duty that our cultures like to emphasize. We had you in the middle of war, and we didn't have you so that you could live like a failure right now, right? These type of things impose a lot of stress onto your parents' generation. And now, by observing that fight or flight, your parents are like, whoa, I shouldn't be able to, I shouldn't be doing that. And in order to not do that, I need to be doing the rat race. And then I need to be competitive, and I need to, go on, I need to strive, I need to go for the future. And that's why American Dream is such a attractive kind of a theme for Asian American immigrants, right? But now, living in a foreign continent, trying to make it out there is a hard thing to do. But they still did it, right? That's why you're here talking about these things. So, because they made it through like this, they imposed this kind of view onto the next generation, right? So overall, what I'm trying to say in this 20-minute video is that you have to recognize why things are like this. There's a big difference between understanding that, oh, it's just something I inherited from my parents. So, for example, the Asian facial features, right? Like the mono eyelid and the relatively flattened nose and things like that. There's one way of thinking about it. It's oh yeah, it's just genetic features. It's just how, races are. But when you look at the, history of mankind, you get to learn that facial features like this have environmental advantages and disadvantages, right? And so that's why different races, different people of color, different ethnicities diverge different ways because they adapt to the region that they live in. When you understand that, you have a deeper kind of affinity with your features, and you understand, oh, so this is what makes me an Asian, right? So There's a big difference between you knowing, oh, this trait, like, yeah, my dad was competitive and my grandfather was like super, like on edge. There's that level of knowing, and there's a completely different level of knowing, because you get it. And it's not personal. They didn't mean to fuck up your life like this. They didn't mean to make your life go through this kind of a grind. It's an unfortunate side effect of global powers, which is like the super fucked up thing, right? Like, it's not like all the entire continent of Asia signed up for this. But when bigger forces warp everything in, everything just gets caught in the middle of a crossfire. And again, that is why it's so important for me to emphasize world peace. It's so important. And what do you, like, okay, so well, how do I practice world peace? Of course, you can donate to organizations that help the victims of war, right? But more importantly, your personal mental health and our collective mental health, our collective resilience against mental struggles is what stops the circle of violence from starting to roll in the first place, because there's nothing for us to be angry about. So, with that, let's continue exploring this in the future videos in the days to come.